It is my privilege to be with you today, this Sabbath, August 14, 2021, to join you in this Inter-American Division Stewardship Congress. It's been my privilege to have been invited by Pastor Vodusco and Pastor Herrera to join you today. I've been asked to share with you for the next few moments on the subject God provides in the tithing system. There are going to be 6 areas that we look at today: the purpose of tithing, the practice of tithing, the principles related to tithing, the policies related to tithing, the patterns associated with tithing, and the promise associated with tithing. A foundational thought for us to consider: God is the creator, and we are the created. God is the owner, and we are the stewards. And tithing then is our expression of these facts. God is the creator. We are the created. God is the owner, and we are the stewards. And again, tithing is our expression of these facts. In Leviticus 27, verse 30, we find a foundational text for us to understand. A tithe of everything from the land, whether grain from the soil or fruit from the trees, belongs to the Lord. It is holy to the Lord. And Ellen White speaks to us in Testimonies to the Church. God gives man 9/10, while he claims 1/10 for sacred purposes. And he has given man 6 days for his own work, and has reserved and set apart the 7th day to himself. For like the Sabbath, 1/10 of the increase is sacred. God has reserved it for himself. He will carry forward his work upon the earth with the increase of the means that he has entrusted to man. And as we look at that foundational text and that thought from Ellen White, 2 themes emerge. Or the tithe belongs to God. The use of tithe is directed by God. Again, the tithe belongs to God. The use of tithe is directed by God. And those are premised on a covenant relationship with God. A covenant relationship where we are obedient to God in returning what is His, and He blesses us. A covenant relationship with God, when we are obedient to Him, He blesses us, but He also blesses others as He directs the use of tithe. So now let's look at the purpose of tithing. And there are 3 areas that we're going to highlight today. 1, tithing allows us to situate God as first place in our life. Not second, not in a peripheral place, but as first place in our life. Tithing also allows us to surmount our desires of selfishness. That innate desire in us to be selfish. What is mine is mine. What is yours is mine. What is God's is also mine. But tithing allows us to surmount our desires of selfishness. Tithing also allows us to support the gospel ministry. 3 principles, 3 purposes of tithing: situate God as first place in our life, surmount our desires of selfishness, and support the gospel ministry. So we have looked at the purpose of tithing. Now we'll look at the practice of tithing. And some may say, well, this is an archaic principle, an archaic law from the Old Testament that has no bearing on us today. But as we look at the practice of tithing, it existed even before the Israelites. Abraham and Jacob, in Genesis, you'll find that they themselves engaged in the practice of tithing. Jesus Christ, when He lived on this earth, He endorsed the matter of tithing. As He spoke to the Pharisees in the temple, He had said to them in Luke and in Matthew, as is written in those Gospels, that you are so diligent in your tithing and you forget the other elements of justice and how you love God and love God's people. And he closes out his admonishment of the Pharisees by saying you need to do both, to tithe as well as to love and to have justice and mercy towards God's people. Then the Apostle Paul in Corinthians, in his letter to the church at Corinth, he spoke about tithing as well and explained how tithing needs to be used to support the gospel ministry as they were in the early church and trying to spread the gospel to the world known at that time. So tithing existed before the Israelites. It was endorsed by Jesus Christ and it was expounded on by the Apostle Paul. But tithing has also been embraced by the Christian church. Not only the Christian church, but our Seventh-day Adventist church, as we have looked through the scriptures in our Bible and as we have understood the counsels of Ellen White, we recognize that this is a gift from our God, the tithing system, to be able to support the gospel ministry of the church. We have looked at the purpose of tithing. We've looked at the practice of tithing. Now let us look at the principles related to tithing. And those principles are, and these are timeless principles. God owns the tithe. God owns the tithe. He is the creator. He is the creator. We are the created. God owns the tithe. God directs the use of the tithe. And God establishes a system for collecting the tithe, a central storehouse, a place where it should be collected and then distributed for the purposes for which he directs. And finally, God expects everyone in every time to tithe. Tithing is not something that is just relegated to a particular culture or a particular point in time or to a particular class of people. Tithing is for everyone and in every time. So again, those principles of tithing. God owns the tithe. God directs the use of the tithe. God establishes a system for collecting tithe. And God expects everyone in every time to tithe. So we have looked at the purpose of tithing, the practice of tithing, the principles of tithing, and we'll now look at the policies related to tithing. In the Seventh-day Adventist Church, there are several policies that the church uses and is guided by each and every year. And there's a particular section in the General Conference Working Policy and in all the policies throughout our church that is related to the use of tithe, the receipt of tithe, the sharing of tithe, and the reporting of tithe. And in the section on the policy that relates to receiving tithe, the expectation is that the local conference is the storehouse where tithe should be received. It comes through the churches, and the churches remit this tithe to the storehouse, which has been identified as the local conference. So that's in our policies that we have voted, and we have embraced, and that is what we practice. But also in these policies is how we share the tithe at the different levels of the church, at the local conference, at the unions, at the divisions, at the general conference, the 4 levels of the church, how we share the tithe to support the gospel ministry. And those policies also continue to highlight and identify how tithe should be used, as well as how tithe should not be used. And later I'll share those policies in more detail as to the use of tithe, the permissible use of tithe, and the impermissible use of tithe. Then the policy finally talks about a report to ensure that every pathway or every stop along the way, from the local church to the local conference to the union to the division and the general conference, the sacredness of that tithe is retained. And it is important then for us to report on what was received, how it was used, and has it been used within the context of our understanding of how God directs the use of tithe. But let me share with you what the policy says on the permissible uses of tithe. Tithe can be used for pastors and evangelists and ministers, also for soul winning support, for literature evangelists, evangelistic activities, evangelistic equipment that supports those evangelistic activities, auditing costs, as well as Bible and religion teachers, retirement costs for those who are involved in soul winning activities, housing for personnel, subsidies for school in a very limited way, missionaries that go across the world to share the gospel to every kindred, tongue, and people, and then mission outreach related organizations. So those are the permissible uses of tithe that have been documented in our policies for our church. Now, in that same policy, there are some uses of tithe that are not allowed. Those being building and facilities, or equipment that is not used in evangelistic causes or activities, cannot be used or spent for from tithe. Local church operating expense and school operating expense. Based on the counsels of Ellen White and our understanding of Scripture, these are uses of tithe that are not allowed. Sharing of resources. As I mentioned to you, the policy talks about the receipt of tithe, the sharing of tithe, the use of tithe, and the reporting of tithe. But Ellen White provides counsel in manuscript 11, written in 1908, where she talks about sharing of resources. And here's what she says. More and more, we must come to realize that the means that come into our conference in the tithes and gifts of our people should be used in the support of the work, not only in the American cities, but also in the foreign fields. Let the means so zealously collected be unselfishly distributed. She wrote that in 1908, and our church has embraced this understanding of sharing resources. The storehouse, the local conference. Some is shared with the union, some is shared with the division, and then some is also shared with the general conference for supporting the gospel ministry. We have looked at the purpose of tithe, the practice of tithe, the principles related to tithe, the policies related to tithe, and now we're going to look at those patterns related to tithe. And over the next few slides, I'm going to share with you patterns over a 20-year period as relates to the receipt of tithe in our church. But before I get to that, I just want to kind of show you a graphic here that kind of looks at 1863 and compare that to 150 years later in 2013, 1863 when the General Conference was organized, and 150 years later in 2013. In 1863, there were 125 churches. In 2013, there were 145,000 churches. In 1863, there were 6 conferences. In 2013, there were 626 conferences. In 1863, there were no unions. In 2013, 150 years later, there were 132 unions. Divisions, there were no divisions in 1863. Today we have 13 divisions, 13 world divisions. Schools, there were no schools in 1863. But today, in 2013, 150 years later, there are 7,579 schools. To God be the glory. In 1863, we had no hospitals. But in 2013, 150 years later, we had 173 hospitals. But take a look at tithe, the subject of our discussion today. In 1863, the total tithe for the Seventh-day Adventist Church was $8,000. But 150 years later, the total tithe in 2013 was $2.4 billion. Let's think about it for a moment. In 2013, 150 years later, from $8,000 to $2.4 billion. What a mighty God we serve. What a blessing we have received for the tithe, for the support of the gospel ministry. World offerings, $133 million. Local offerings, $745 million. Now, let's look over 20 years what God has wrought in the world church from 2001 to 2021 as it relates to tithe. In 2001, tithe was $1.1 billion in 2001. But in 2021, global world tithe was $2.3 billion. At some point in 2018, it actually went up to $2.5 billion because of the economic crises, and lately in 2020, because of COVID and the pandemic, there has been a dip in tithe, and now tithe is at $2.3 billion. And we're in Inter-American division right now. So the orange line, and the orange part of this graphic, as you will see, will notice that Inter-American division in 2001 contributed to the world tithe of $120 million. But in 2020, that contribution was $235 million. Now we look at the next slide with tithe and membership growth for the world. And as we look at the gray line, we will recognize that the membership growth from 2000 to 2020 has been in decline. Around about 5.8% was the rate of growth for membership back in the year 2001. But now in the year 2020, that rate of growth is closer to 1.8%. But as we compare that with tithe, we'll notice tithe is all over the place. It is up in some years, significantly down in some years. When it is significantly down, like in the year 2009, you see this significant rebound of a 12% growth in tithe. But then over the years through 2016, we see a considerable decline. Then it rebounds again in 2017. Now in 2020, we see negative growth as it relates to tithe. Well, now let's look at tithe and membership growth in Inter-American division in particular. And it's pretty consistent with what we see with the world church. In 2001, the tithe growth was at 10%. It increased in 2005 all the way up to about 18%. But now, in 2020, tithe has had a negative growth of 10.64%. But we look at membership growth. And membership growth was at about 4.9% per year in the year 2001. But in 2020, now we start to see a decline in the negative area for membership growth for Inter-American division. What about tithe per capita? That's the amount of members, or the amount of tithe that is received by the world church, or an Inter-American division for this case, and divide that by the amount of members. So for the world church, in 2001, the tithe per capita was $90 per person. And in 2020, that amount went up to $105. In Inter-American division, it was $55 per person. And then pretty much flatline, and in 2020, that number is 63. So just some patterns of tithe, and as it relates to membership as well, that I'm sharing with you today. Then the next slide talks about the weekly tithe, the weekly amount that comes through all of our churches and then arrives at the storehouse, which is the local conference. In 2001, $21.4 million came through every week in tithe. Think about that. In 2001, every week, as we went to our churches around the world, and in Inter-American division, as well as the other divisions, $21.4 million came in just in tithe alone for that week. But in 2020, that amount is $44 million every single week. To God be the glory. But in Inter-America Division, in that orange part of the graph that you're looking at, in 2001, 2.3 million dollars came in every week, and in 2020, $4.5 million came in every single week to the local church. As we continue with the pattern of tithe, now let's look at how $1 of tithe is used and shared throughout the world. The Seventh-day Adventist Church has determined that the local church will send $1, the full $1 of tithe, to the local conference, as it has been designated as the storehouse. The full $1 of tithe would be sent to the local conference, which is the storehouse. On average, the local conference uses 86 cents of that tithe received from the local church to pay pastors, operate the conference office and its ministry and evangelistic programs, subsidize any youth camps, elementary schools, or academies that it may operate within its territory, but as well contribute to the retirement plan being administered on its behalf for those workers who are involved in the gospel ministry. Then on average, the local conference sends 14 cents of the tithe received from the local church to the union within that territory where it resides. And this is in response to the principle of sharing tithe and the resources that we read earlier that Ellen White counseled us to share tithe among ourselves for the support of the gospel work. Then on average, the union uses 4 cents of the tithe received at the local church to operate its administrative offices, conduct ministry and evangelistic programs, and subsidize any educational or mission-related institutions that it may operate. And then, on average, the union sends 10 cents of the tithe received from the local church to the division in which it operates, in that territory which it operates, in response to the principle of sharing tithe. And then, on average, a division uses 3 cents of that tithe it receives from the local church to operate its administrative offices, conduct ministry and evangelistic programs, and subsidize any educational and mission-related institutions within its territory. And then, on average, a division sends 7 cents of the tithe received from the local church to the general conference as a response to the principle of sharing tithe and supporting the gospel ministry from around the world. Having shared this with you in terms of how tithe is received, and all of it now arrives at the storehouse, which is a local conference, and it is shared at different levels of the church, I share with you a very concerning finding that has been studied over the past few years. Global estimates indicate that less than 50% of church members return a faithful tithe or support the local church or the global mission of the church in their giving. Less than 50%. Now that's a concern, and as I shared with you the matter of $2.4 billion, or in 2018, $2.5 billion of tithe coming in through the local churches and into the storehouse and being used to support the gospel ministry around the world. But only less than 50% of church members return a faithful tithe or support the local and global mission of the church. Well, what if it was a little bit more than 50%? What if it was more or closer to 100% of all of us engaged and being faithful and responding in obedience to what God requires of us to return to Him what He owns? What more could we do? How much further could this gospel go? That's something for us to think about. So we've looked at the purpose of tithe. We've looked at the practice of tithe. Looked at the principles of tithing. We looked at the policies of the church related to tithing. We looked at the patterns of tithing over the last 20 years. But let's look at the promise related to tithing. And here we find in Proverbs 3, verse 9 to 10, honor the Lord with your wealth, with the first fruits of all your crops, Then your barns will be filled to overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. Honor the Lord. Then your barns will be filled with overflowing, and your vats will brim over with new wine. That's a promise. But here's another promise. Malachi 3 and verse 10, we are familiar with this. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse, that there may be food in my house. Test me in this. Other versions of the scripture says, prove me in this, says the Lord Almighty, and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. That's a promise. Bring the whole tithe and see if I will not throw open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be room enough to store it. Earlier I talked about the covenant relationship. God owns the tithe, and God directs the use of the tithe. And in that understanding, that covenant relationship, there is a blessing for you and for me. But in that covenant relationship as well, there is a blessing for others as the tithe is used to support the gospel ministry of God's church. My first acquaintance with tithing was a lesson that I learned from my father. Every summer, as the mangoes would bloom in the season, my father required of me each summer, to write down every single mango that came off the tree. We could eat the mangoes, but we had to make an accounting, and my accounting career started right back in those summers, making an accounting of those mangoes. Write down an accounting for all the mangoes that came off the tree. Then I remember going with my father. We'd go to the marketplace to find out how much were mangoes being sold for. And what my father would do is price out all of those mangoes that came off that tree, and he would give a tithe to the Lord from those mangoes. He honored the Lord with the increase. He honored the Lord with the increase from those mangoes. Now, you may not necessarily do that, but I'm just saying that to you. That was my first encounter in understanding how to honor the Lord and give him the first fruits of our increase. There is a promise in tithing. Honor the Lord. Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse and see if the Lord will not open the floodgates of heaven and pour out so much blessing that there will not be enough room to even store it. Now I want to close. In this matter of tithing, the tithing system that the Lord has endorsed and has made available to his church, so it can be used for us to overcome our own selfishness, but more importantly as well to support the gospel ministry of the church. All of us who are here today, as we are in this Congress, the Stewardship Congress for the Inter-American Division, as leaders, here is my counsel to you through the words of Ellen White. As we look at the matter of stewardship, let us not look at it just to get more money so we can pay more pastors. It's a relationship that we need to promote, a covenant relationship where our members are obedient to God. Not only they are members, but we ourselves as leaders are obedient to God and the blessing that we receive from God for obedience. But the counsel I leave with us as leaders, for those of us placed in the role of stewardship for these resources of the church, heaven is watching to see how those occupying positions of influence fulfill their stewardship. The demands upon them as stewards are measured by the extent of their influence. God gave us this tithing system. God gave us this tithing system for a purpose. And one of those purposes is to finish this work. So let us rally together, leaders and members. Let us be committed and be faithful. Prove God in this. Test God in this. And see if He'll not open the windows of heaven, that there will not be any room to store it.